In February 2026, a dead Starlink satellite collided with a Chinese rocket stage in low Earth orbit at a closing speed of 15 kilometers per second. The impact lasted 3 milliseconds. It generated over 40,000 trackable fragments larger than 1 centimeter, and an estimated 2 million pieces too small for radar to see. Within 48 hours, those fragments had triggered 37 secondary collisions. Within 1 week, low Earth orbit had become a death zone, moving at 17,000 miles per hour. This was not an accident. It was a mathematical inevitability we ignored for 60 years. The phenomenon is called Kessler Syndrome, named after NASA scientist Donald Kessler, who predicted this exact scenario in 1978. He understood something most people never consider. Debris in orbit does not fall down. It stays up there, circling the planet at 17,000 miles per hour for decades or centuries, depending on altitude. Every piece is a weapon with the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. The math is simple and terrifying. One collision creates hundreds of fragments. Each fragment can cause another collision. Each of those collisions creates hundreds more fragments. It is an exponential curve with no ceiling and no brakes. The primary impact occurred on February 14th at 1700 hours Coordinated Universal Time. 3 milliseconds of violence transformed 2 objects into 40,000 trackable pieces of shrapnel. Within 48 hours, those 40,000 fragments had struck 37 other satellites and rocket bodies. Now, there were 217,000 fragments larger than 1 centimeter screaming through the orbital band between 300 and 800 kilometers altitude. That altitude band is where civilization lives. Weather satellites, communication satellites, reconnaissance satellites, the International Space Station. Everything we depend on orbits in that narrow shell of space we just filled with buckshot. Here is what people do not understand about orbital mechanics. There are no brakes in space. When you fire a bullet on Earth, it slows down and falls. In orbit, there is no air resistance. A fragment moving at 15 kilometers per second will keep moving at 15 kilometers per second for decades. The kinetic energy has nowhere to go except into the next thing it hits. Imagine firing a shotgun inside a sealed room where the pellets never stop bouncing. Eventually, the room becomes lethal to enter. Orbital space is that room. We fired the shotgun, and we are trapped inside. By February 17th, amateur astronomer David Walsh was watching through his telescope from rural Montana. He saw streaks of light multiplying across his field of view like sparklers. Satellites were exploding in real time as debris punctured solar panels and fuel tanks. He thought he was witnessing the best meteor shower of his life. Then he checked social media and understood he was watching civilization as infrastructure disintegrate. Observers in Australia, Chile, and South Africa reported the same phenomenon. Thousands of videos appeared online. People were excited at first. The comments were full of wonder. Then the experts started explaining what was actually happening. The excitement curdled into horror. SpaceX issued a statement on February 18th confirming they had lost contact with 214 Starlink satellites in 8 hours. Elon Musk posted on his platform, "This is worst-case scenario we hoped would never happen in our lifetime." The company went silent after that. There was nothing left to say. The United States Space Command released tracking data showing the debris cloud expanding faster than their models could calculate. An Air Force general compared it to trying to track individual raindrops in a hurricane. They could see the swarm, but not the individual pieces. Every radar return represented a potential collision they could not prevent. 3 days after the primary impact, every space agency on Earth suspended launches indefinitely. The rockets sat on their pads. The astronauts waited in quarantine. The industry held its collective breath and realized that orbital access might be gone for generations. But the debris field itself was just physics. The real catastrophe was what happened on the ground when the satellites died. You do not realize how much of modern civilization happens 400 kilometers above your head until it stops happening. GPS is not just directions on your phone. It is the timing signal that synchronizes every cell tower, every financial transaction, every power grid. The internet is not magic wireless. 70% of intercontinental data travels through satellites. Aviation does not navigate by looking out the window. When the orbital infrastructure died, the ground infrastructure had 48 hours before it started eating itself. The GPS constellation lost 23 of its 31 satellites by February 20th. The fragmentation pattern had targeted the orbital plane where GPS satellites cluster. Pure bad luck. Or maybe it was inevitable given how crowded that region had become. Container ships in the Pacific lost navigation first. Captains trained entirely on GPS had never learned to use a sextant. Vessels stopped mid-ocean, engines idling, waiting for instructions that could not come because the communication satellites were also dying. Trillions of dollars of cargo drifted in international waters with no way to know where it was or where it should go. The Federal Aviation Administration issued a global notice on February 21st, suspending all commercial flights indefinitely. Modern aircraft cannot navigate without GPS. They cannot land without GPS precision approach systems. Pilots train in simulators with GPS always working. 30,000 flights per day stopped. Passengers were stranded in airports. Airlines hemorrhaged money. But there was no choice. Flying blind was suicide. Here is what most people do not know about GPS. Its most important function is not location. It is time. Every GPS satellite carries atomic clocks accurate to billionths of a second. Those clocks provide timing synchronization for systems that need to coordinate across vast distances. Stock exchanges closed on February 22nd. Every financial transaction is time-stamped by GPS. Without synchronization, you cannot verify trade order. You cannot prevent fraud. You cannot settle accounts. The global financial system runs on GPS time, and GPS time was gone. Power grids use GPS to synchronize phase across hundreds of miles of transmission lines. When the satellites died, the Texas grid began experiencing fluctuations on February 23rd. Engineers instituted rolling blackouts to prevent cascade failure. The alternative was the entire grid collapsing into darkness. Cell phone towers use GPS timing to prevent interference between adjacent cells. Service degraded 70% in the first week. Calls dropped. Data slowed to dial-up speeds. People could not understand why their phones did not work when there was no visible damage. The damage was invisible. It was 400 kilometers straight up. Emergency services collapsed. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars still had engines and radios, but they had no navigation. Los Angeles Fire Department reported response times doubled in the first week. Dispatchers read addresses over the radio. Drivers used paper maps they had not looked at in 20 years. A diabetic in Portland died on February 24th because the ambulance took 47 minutes to find his address instead of 12. His name was Robert Chun. He was 39 years old. He called 911 when his blood sugar crashed. The paramedics got lost 4 times trying to navigate streets that looked nothing like they remembered. 3 billion people experienced major infrastructure disruption in the first 10 days. A professor of aeronautics at MIT told reporters, "We built civilization on a foundation of orbital infrastructure and never built backup systems because we assumed satellites were permanent." 7 astronauts and cosmonauts were on the International Space Station when the Cascade began. They watched the debris counts rising on their monitors. They understood before anyone told them that they might be trapped indefinitely. The debris field made launch and re-entry suicidal. Any Soyuz capsule attempting to descend would be shredded by fragments traveling at bullet speed. Any rescue vehicle trying to ascend would face the same blender. The crew had 6 months of oxygen remaining and 4 months of food. The station's micrometeoroid shields were hit 37 times in the first week. Normally, the station is struck once per month. Holes appeared in modules. The crew patched them with emergency sealant. They were running out of patches. Astronaut Michael Hammond kept a journal. An entry from February 26th was leaked to the press. We volunteered to risk our lives exploring space, not to die trapped in orbit watching Earth below us, unable to come home. The entry went viral. People who had never thought about space suddenly understood that 7 human beings were suffocating in slow motion while the world watched. International emergency meetings convened. Russia blamed China. China blamed commercial operators. The United States demanded a global debris cleanup mission. Everyone knew it was theater. Engineering reality was unambiguous. Any rescue mission would need to launch through the debris field. Mission planners calculated a 30% survival probability for the crew and 40% for the vehicle. Both numbers were unacceptable. The crew was placed in reduced activity mode to conserve resources. They slept more, moved less, breathed shallower. Ground teams calculated whether the debris would naturally deorbit fast enough to open a launch window before supplies ran out. The math was close. Too close. No one said the quiet part out loud. If the window did not open, 7 people would asphyxiate on live television while the world watched helplessly. The internet backbone satellite links were severed. The GPS constellation was gutted. Communication satellites were punctured. The ISS crew was trapped. This was not a temporary outage or a service disruption or a technical difficulty. Orbital space had transformed from highway to minefield in 72 hours. The debris will orbit for a minimum of 50 years at low altitude. At high altitude, 200 years. Every fragment is a bullet traveling 17,000 miles per hour. You cannot sweep it. You cannot catch it. You cannot slow it down. Physics is unambiguous. We broke orbital space. Modern civilization was built on the assumption we could always reach space. That assumption died in February 2026. We are locked on this planet, and we did it to ourselves. The sky above us is no longer frontier. It is graveyard, and we are the ones buried alive. The mathematical reality of what we had done took weeks to fully calculate, but the conclusion was inescapable. We had locked ourselves out of space. Not for a few years, not for a decade, for centuries. Debris orbital lifetime depends on altitude. Low orbits experience drag from the thin upper atmosphere and deorbit within years. Medium altitude fragments between 500 and 800 kilometers will stay up for 50 to 100 years. High altitude debris above 1,000 kilometers will orbit for 200 years minimum. Some pieces will still be circling the planet in 1,000 years. We cannot launch through the debris field. A spacecraft needs to reach 7.8 kilometers per second to achieve orbit. Debris travels at 15 kilometers per second in random directions. The closing velocity between an ascending rocket and a tumbling fragment is lethal. A piece of shrapnel 10 centimeters across carries the kinetic energy of 1 ton of TNT. It does not need to be large to destroy you. The collision probability grows exponentially even with 0 new launches. Every piece of wreckage will eventually hit something else. That collision creates more fragments. Those fragments cause more collisions. The mathematics is unforgiving. The debris field will continue growing for the next 2 centuries. Invisit is a dead European Space Agency satellite the size of a school bus orbiting at 780 kilometers altitude. It weighs 8 tons. Orbital mechanics calculations give it a 93% chance of catastrophic collision within the next 75 years. When it gets hit, it will generate an estimated 150,000 fragments larger than 1 centimeter. Each of those fragments becomes a new weapon. The Cascade feeds itself. Every proposed cleanup mission requires launching a spacecraft. If that mission fails, you have added more debris. If it succeeds in capturing 1 piece, you still have millions more. A MIT engineering team ran the numbers in March 2026. Their conclusion was published in Nature and read by every space agency on Earth. The mathematics showed that cleanup attempts make the problem worse, not better. Every mission adds statistical risk that outweighs any potential debris removal. An orbital engineer from the European Space Agency described it in testimony to the United Nations. Imagine being locked in a room where the walls are invisible bars made of bullets. The bars are moving faster than you can see. You cannot touch them. You cannot stop them. You cannot slow them down. That is orbital space now. We build a cage around our own planet, and the bars will be there longer than human civilization has existed. The International Space Station crew reached critical supply status in May 2026. Oxygen reserves dropped below safety margins. Food supplies entered final month. Psychological evaluations showed deteriorating mental state. The world watched 7 people dying in slow motion on live video feeds they maintained until the end. Debris density calculations showed a 47% impact probability during ascent, 53% during docking maneuvers, 61% during re-entry. No mission had ever launched with acceptable risk above 10%. These numbers were suicide statistics. Russia proposed an armored supply vehicle with reinforced shielding. Engineers calculated the additional mass would require so much fuel that impact probability increased to 72%. The project was abandoned. The United States offered an unmanned fast approach trajectory that would minimize exposure time. An ISS crew member responded in a press conference. So we get to watch a robot explode instead of rescue astronauts? China fast-tracked development of a debris-clearing laser system to create a temporary corridor. The physics showed it would take 18 months to clear a path. The crew had 6 weeks. On June 3, 2026, the United Nations convened an emergency session. Administrators from every space agency presented their proposals. Every proposal included survival percentages below 50%. The conclusion was presented by the NASA administrator in a speech that lasted 4 minutes and destroyed the dreams of an entire species. He said, "We cannot save them. Any rescue attempt will kill more people than it saves." The crew understands this. They have requested we stop trying. The crew entered hibernation mode on June 8th. Life support was stretched to maximum duration. Metabolism slowed. Activity reduced to minimum. They bought themselves until September. The debris counts continued rising. No launch window opened. The feeds went dark on September 19th. Official statements cited loss of signal. Everyone knew what it meant. Humanity had dreamed of Mars colonies and Europa missions and solar system exploration for a century. We had convinced ourselves we were a spacefaring species. The truth was we never truly left Earth. We stuck our toe in the water. We built a few satellites and a single station 400 kilometers up. We called it space. Now, even that was impossible. So we did what humans always do when trapped. We adapted to the cage. The first generation after the Cascade focused on survival, not mourning. GPS was dead. Internet backbone was severed. Weather satellites were silent. Every orbital dependent system needed to be rebuilt using pre-satellite technology. We became archaeological engineers excavating blueprints from before the space age. The Transoceanic Cable Consortium began work in July 2026. 14 nations pooled $73 billion. The project required laying 42,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Specialized ships deployed cable at depths reaching 6,000 meters. The work took 9 years. By 2035, global internet bandwidth had recovered to 48% of pre-Cascade levels. It would never reach higher than that. Aviation reverted to ground-based radio navigation beacons from the 1950s. The technology was less accurate by a factor of 100. Flight times increased an average of 23 minutes per route. Fuel costs increased 37%. Airlines that survived the initial shutdown operated at permanent loss. Ticket prices tripled. Flying became luxury travel again, like it was in the 1960s. The container ship Maersk Halifax ran aground off the coast of Portugal on August 14, 2026. 19 crew members died. The captain was 51 years old and had spent his entire career navigating with GPS. The paper charts on board were outdated by 12 years. The coastline had changed. Rocks that did not appear on the maps tore open the hull. The ship sank in 4 hours. Investigators found the captain had never been trained to use a sextant or calculate position from stars. Financial markets required atomic clock synchronization to prevent fraud and verify trade order. A consortium of banks installed ground-based atomic clock networks connected by dedicated fiber optic lines in major financial centers. The system took 14 months to build and cost $190 billion. Markets reopened in August 2027. Global GDP had contracted by 11%. The contraction was permanent. We had built an economy that required orbital infrastructure, and that infrastructure was gone forever. Cellular networks required timing precision that GPS had provided. Replacing it meant laying fiber optic timing cables to every cell tower. In the United States alone, this required 400,000 kilometers of new cable. Rural areas with low population density could not justify the cost. 37 million Americans lost cell service permanently. They bought landlines again. Rotary phones appeared in antique stores and sold as functional necessities. Weather forecasting collapsed to 1960s accuracy levels. Meteorologists could no longer see storm systems forming over oceans or track hurricanes from birth. Hurricane Gabriella hit the Gulf Coast in September 2027 with 48 hours warning instead of the usual 7 days. Evacuations were incomplete. 2,300 people died. Before the Cascade, that number would have been under 100. Military forces lost precision guidance. Smart bombs became dumb bombs again. Reconnaissance satellites were gone. Intelligence agencies returned to U-2 spy, planes, and human operatives. Accuracy degraded. Response times increased. The United States military estimated its operational capability had declined to 1980s levels. The total global cost to rebuild inferior ground-based infrastructure exceeded $4 trillion. We spent $4 trillion to build systems worse than what we had before. And we could never get the satellites back. Some engineers believed they could outsmart the physics. The ballistic gamble was simple in concept. Launch on a suborbital trajectory that never reaches orbital velocity. Go up. Perform your mission in the few minutes before you fall back down. Return to Earth before the debris can find you. Brief space access. Minimal exposure. The European Space Agency launched the first ballistic science probe on March 7, 2028. The mission reached an altitude of 412 kilometers. The payload performed atmospheric measurements for 6 minutes. During re-entry, a fragment the size of a golf ball struck the heat shield at 19 kilometers per second. The shield failed. The probe disintegrated over the Atlantic. Wreckage fell into the ocean. Debris tracking showed the impact generated 73 new fragments above 1 centimeter. We had made the problem worse trying to solve it. Virgin Galactic attempted a different approach in November 2028. They launched a crewed vehicle on a steep ballistic arc designed to minimize time in the debris zone. The ascent was successful. The crew reached 400 kilometers and deployed a communication relay satellite meant to operate for 3 hours before controlled deorbit. The satellite was struck 47 seconds after deployment. The explosion was visible from the ground. The crew descended safely, but returned with nothing but video of their payload dying. Engineers calculated the probability. Every successful ballistic mission placed a target in the debris field. Even if the mission worked perfectly, the payload spent minutes or hours in orbit. That was enough time to be hit. And every mission that failed added more wreckage. The mathematics showed that ballistic access made future attempts exponentially more dangerous. The International Space Council voted on February 12, 2029 to permanently cancel all ballistic programs. A NASA engineer testified, "We are prisoners trying to dig a tunnel through a minefield. Every shovel of dirt we move might trigger an explosion that collapses the tunnel. The safer choice is to stop digging. By 2030, The space industry had been dismantled. Launch facilities at Cape Canaveral, Baikonur, Kourou, and Jiuquan stood empty and rusting. Gantries corroded. Launch pads cracked. Rockets that would never fly were cut apart and sold for scrap. The astronaut corps retired or died. No one trained replacements. Universities stopped offering orbital engineering degrees. The knowledge became historical curiosity, like Latin or cuneiform. Children born after the Cascade never expected to leave the planet. Space became mythology. The International Space Station was visible through telescopes as a tomb we could see but never reach. The debris field appeared as a glittering cloud of failed ambition catching sunlight at dawn and dusk. We had built a cage around our own planet. The bars were invisible but absolute. We had thrown the key into the cell with ourselves. But the worst part was not that we were trapped. The worst part was what we realized when we looked at the stars and understood we were alone. By the year 2050, an entire generation had grown up without ever seeing a rocket launch. They did not mourn what they had never known. The launch facilities had become industrial ruins. Cape Canaveral's gantries were orange with rust, their metal bones visible through peeling paint. Baikonur's assembly buildings housed grain storage instead of spacecraft. Kourou's launch pads grew jungle vines that wrapped around concrete, like the planet reclaiming what we had stolen from it. The vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center was converted into a vertical farm. Where rockets once stood, lettuce grew under LED lights. The knowledge died with the people who held it. The last orbital engineers were in their 70s and 80s by 2050. Universities had stopped teaching orbital mechanics in 2032. The skills became archaeological curiosities. Students studied Tsiolkovsky and von Braun the same way they studied Archimedes and Leonardo. Brilliant minds from an era when reaching for space seemed possible. A child asked her father in 2048 what the rusting towers at Cape Canaveral were for. He told her they were for flying to the moon. She asked if they could go. He said no, the sky was broken now. She asked when it would be fixed. He said never. She accepted this the way children accept that dinosaurs are extinct or that mammoths do not exist anymore. Some things belong to history, not to the future. Space travel became like sail-powered ships after the steam age arrived. Romantic history. Adventure stories. Not practical future. Children read about Apollo and Soyuz and the space shuttle the way previous generations read about clipper ships and Age of Sail. Beautiful, distant, and utterly irrelevant to their lives. The debris field was visible from the ground through telescopes at dawn and dusk. It appeared as a glittering band encircling the planet like Saturn's rings, except these rings were made of shrapnel moving at 17,000 miles per hour. Astronomers called it the Kessler belt. Poets called it other things. From space perspective, if you could somehow view Earth from outside the debris zone, it looked like a blue marble wrapped in a shell of broken metal. The shell was not solid. It was a probabilistic cloud of fragments orbiting in thousands of different planes and inclinations. But the density was high enough that nothing could pass through without being destroyed. We had built a sphere of destruction around our own planet. Tracking data in 2050 cataloged over 14 million fragments larger than 1 centimeter. Millions more existed below detection threshold. Orbital decay calculations showed the lowest altitude debris would deorbit by 2150. The highest altitude fragments would remain until the year 3000. The density was comparable to the asteroid belt, except compressed into a shell only 500 kilometers thick instead of spread across millions of kilometers. An artist in Berlin created an installation in 2047 called Crown of Hubris. It was a scale model of Earth surrounded by LED lights representing each tracked fragment, blinking in real time as the debris orbited. The installation was supposed to be beautiful. It was horrifying. Viewers stood in the dark watching 14 million lights swarm around a globe, understanding that each light represented a piece of the cage. The installation was dismantled after 3 weeks. People found it too depressing to look at. The psychological shift happened gradually, then suddenly. In 2030, people still talked about the debris as a temporary problem. By 2040, it was a permanent feature of Earth like the moon or the ocean. You did not question it. You did not fight it. It simply was. Humanity evolved ground-locked. The new generation did not dream of Mars colonies. They dreamed of the deep ocean trenches and the Earth's mantle. Exploration turned inward instead of outward. Engineers designed submarines that could reach the bottom of the Mariana Trench and stay there for months. Mining companies drilled toward the core, seeking geothermal energy and rare earth elements kilometers below the surface. The frontier became vertical instead of horizontal. Fusion power research accelerated because we needed energy sources that did not depend on weather satellites. Underground cities were planned for regions threatened by climate change. Ocean colonization became serious business with floating cities and submerged habitats. We terraformed Earth because we could not reach other planets to terraform them. The Mars rover's Perseverance and Curiosity were still functioning, sending data across the solar system. They had outlived their design lifetimes by decades, still exploring, still discovering, completely alone. We received their transmissions, but could never send replacements, could never retrieve their samples, could never follow their tracks. They were the loneliest machines in the solar system, ambassadors of a species that could no longer travel. The philosopher Hannah Way wrote in 2053, "We are not a space-faring species. We are a planetary species that briefly touched space and recoiled. Perhaps this is what we were always meant to be. Perhaps the universe is telling us that our place is here, in the dirt and the ocean, not in the void. We mistook ambition for destiny. The cage we built is the correction." From hypothetical outside perspective, Earth looked like a blue marble wrapped in silver wire. Beautiful and tragic. A garden surrounded by barbed fence. A prison where the inmates were also the guards. We did this to ourselves. No alien invasion. No asteroid impact. No solar flare. We built our own cage and welded it shut. But the silence from orbit was not the end of the horror. It was the beginning of a different realization. In 2075, the James Webb Space Telescope, still functioning in deep orbit beyond the debris field, detected an anomaly around Proxima Centauri. The telescope sat at the L2 Lagrange point, 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, far beyond the lethal shell of fragments that imprisoned our planet. It continued its mission observing the universe while we were trapped below. The spectroscopic data was unambiguous. A megastructure surrounded the star, absorbing specific wavelengths and re-radiating waste heat in infrared. The signature matched theoretical models of a Dyson swarm. Thousands of solar collectors harvesting a star's energy. The construction indicated a civilization at least type 1 on the Kardashev scale, possibly approaching type 2. They had industrialized their solar system. They were out there. They were real. The scientific community reacted with vindication. Decades of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence had finally succeeded. The public reacted with excitement that curdled into crushing realization within hours. We could see them. We could detect their technology. We could analyze their stellar engineering. But we could never reach them. We could never signal them effectively. We could never join them. An astronomer at Harvard said in a press conference, "We are watching the party through a window we can never open. We can see the lights, hear the music, watch them dancing. But we are locked outside in the cold, and they do not know we exist." The Fermi paradox had asked for 70 years. Where is everyone? We finally had an answer. They were out there. Possibly dozens or hundreds of spacefaring civilizations in the galaxy, building megastructures, colonizing star systems, sending ships between the stars. We were not alone, but we were the ones locked in. We had become the anomaly. The only known species that reached space and then locked itself out. Every other civilization that developed rockets apparently managed not to destroy its own orbital environment. Or perhaps they did, and they died, and we were simply the first to survive long enough to realize what we had done. The comparison to evolution was obvious, like a fish that crawled onto land and then built a wall preventing other fish from following. We had touched the ocean of space and contaminated it with our carelessness. Now we could only watch from shore while others swam. Earth was visible to alien telescopes. They could see our planet as spectrum, analyze our atmosphere, detect our electromagnetic emissions. And they could see the debris field. Millions of fragments screaming around our planet in chaotic orbits. What would they conclude? Either we were stupid, or we were a warning. Either they pitted us, or they feared us. Possibly both. Some xenologists suggested other civilizations might avoid us. We were a contaminated planet, a quarantined species. We had proved ourselves too reckless for space. Why would any advanced civilization want contact with a species that destroyed its own orbital environment? We were the cosmic equivalent of a neighbor who burned down his own house. You did not invite him to the block party. The psychological weight was unbearable. Knowing intelligence existed in the universe, but being unable to reach it. Like being the only deaf person in a room full of music. Like being the only blind person in an art gallery. You know something beautiful is happening. Everyone around you experiences it. You're excluded by physics and your own mistakes. Children born after 2075 would live their entire lives knowing humans were trapped on one planet, while the universe was populated with civilizations who had escaped their gravity wells. The knowledge would shape every aspect of their psychology. Every time they looked up, they would see what they could never have. The cultural despair was visible in art and literature. The novel The Last Children of Earth became a bestseller in 2078. It imagined a future where humanity had forgotten how to dream, where the word astronaut meant nothing, where space was mythology and the stars were just lights with no meaning. Critics called it the most depressing book ever written. It won every literary award that year. The night sky changed its meaning. For thousands of years, humans had looked up and felt wonder. After 2075, they looked up and felt grief. The stars were still beautiful, but beauty behind glass you cannot break is torture. A poet named James Okoye wrote, "We are the only species in the universe that can see the stars but cannot touch them. We built telescopes to see farther and cages to keep us close. We are astronomers and prisoners. We know the universe and will never know it. This is the specific horror we created for ourselves. The debris field will remain for 200 years minimum. By the time it clears naturally in the year 2226, will we still remember how to build rockets? Will we still want to? Or will centuries of isolation have changed us into something that no longer looks up? Perhaps children born in 2200 will have evolved beyond the dream of space. Perhaps they will be content in oceans and underground caverns. Perhaps they will not feel the grief we feel now. Perhaps forgetting is a mercy. A child looked at the night sky in 2090 and saw the glittering debris field catching sunlight. She asked her parent what it was. The parent answered, "That is the cage we built when we were young and stupid. That is the price of arrogance. That is what happens when a species reaches too far too fast and breaks what it touches. The stars are still there. We are still here, and we will never meet.